Okay, one of the things about natural law is it presupposes that there's a lawgiver. So we understand the design of the human person, and then from the design of the human person, there are certain things that we can infer from that. So natural law, we'll see, is going to have a little bit of an opposition for people who don't accept that there's a human nature, that somehow that we are designed. Because once you accept it, then you have to accept, just like you would the universe. If you find that there is, given laws to the universe, and at some point you're going to have to come up with the resolution: are they random, or is there something creative and intelligent behind these particular designs? So a law is what guides a good to the proper end, and it's based on the design. This is the real problem we're going to have in catechizing people outside of the faith, and even in new evangelization, which means we're not so much going into the mission field where people have never heard about Christ. We're going into the field of people who know Christ or know of Him, but are indifferent. That's the new evangelization. That's a difficult one to get through. So natural law is going to be, as we see, a nice bridge. It's going to be a bridge to people who don't accept our faith in particular. And it's also going to be a way for us to reason with those who may accept the basis of our faith, as we'll see in the last section when we talk about moral therapeutic deism, the feel-good type religion. So if we can get people to understand that laws are not something on the outside imposed on us, but they are something that govern us and are based on our design, in the same way that we've all, at least most of us, probably have used a screwdriver to try to tap in a nail from time to time, it doesn't do the job right. It ruins the tool. The tool, a screwdriver, is not designed to be used as a hammer. So if you look at that particular tool, you can determine, based on its design, what it's supposed to be used for. That, in a sense, is a law, my sister. All we're trying to say is the same thing for the human person. We'll come back to this, but we're going to say, whatever X is, if we determine that this is good for the human person, then it ought to be done. In the same way that we would do this for a car. Is keeping your oil clean and you're changing your oil filter every 3,000-4,000 miles, is that good for the end or the goal of using the car well? Yes. Then you ought to do those things. And if you see those as laws imposed from the outside, you're really missing the connection between the design of the thing and how we can understand the use of it. And the converse of this is true. If X is not good for a particular end, then we should not do X, whatever that might be. This is where we kind of get confused when people who don't know what natural law is, they immediately think, mutual of Omaha and the world out there. And if you're starting to say it's natural, like when a moral theologian uses the term and say this is natural for the human person, somebody's thinking nature. So you'll hear things like this, because this species or that species does something, then why is it not good for us?
I've thought about this a lot, and it's a misnomer in a way. Has there been any attempt at changing the name to make it, not to say more accurate, but more digestible immediately by people?
Of natural law, because of that? Not that I'm aware of. But you're right, it lends itself to equivocation. Right. So, in other words, you might have heard people make the argument, we have to stop worrying about monogamy and marriages, because of all the species in the world, hardly any of them are truly monogamous. So it's not something that's natural for us. You'll hear that argument. So right there, they are equivocating, and you're using the word nature in two entirely different ways. We're using the word nature as to what is proper to the design of the human person. And it always comes to the human person. And if you don't believe the human person is incarnate, if you believe that we are simply a species, and maybe the highest functioning species that has dominated, the mammalian world, well, then we're going to have two competing understandings of the human person. And then we'll go back to the Hobbesian understanding of nature, where we try to simply overtake the other person, or we set up certain laws, like Nietzsche with the morality of the slave. Why are there laws? Because the slaves and the priest class didn't have the power, so they had to put laws in place to keep the rulers in check. I mean, that's where all that comes from, right? So just let's make sure that if we're ever talking about this, we're clear on this as we're talking to somebody. So it's a law that is in man's nature. Now, what's good about this is something that can be understood and acquiesced just with the aid of human reason. So we're going to see when we look at different types of law that this is not the same thing as divine law or eternal law. So we don't, in a sense, now when I say we don't need grace for this, let's be very clear that if you understand grace is that which sustains the human person, yes, okay, if God were to withdraw that, his life in us, we would wither. But this isn't something that, a Christian is going to have, well, I shouldn't say that because grace would help this. Let's just leave it at that and not try to elaborate too much. This is something that's intelligible to every person. And this will be scriptural. We'll see that. We'll learn later that the Decalogue is not natural law, but all the things of natural law are contained within the Decalogue. So we can say then, this is right from the Catechism, that what we read in the Decalogue, this becomes some privileged expression of natural law. So from the very beginning, God has implanted this in our hearts, and because of this, none of us are with excuse. Now, without getting romantic about it, this is how God rules the world. So all these things, he's not, we never have that fear of having the watchmaker God, the God who puts it all together, winds it up, and then steps back and lets the whole thing run. If somebody says, how is God involved in our lives on a daily basis? Well, besides the fact that his love basically sustains our very being, and if he were to withdraw that love, we would wither, he also governs us through the law that he has written in our heart. And we'll find out that this natural law is a way that we constantly participate in with him. So there's never an exclusion of him in the way that we live and in the way that we understand our morality. It's always best to start out with a definition. So right from the Summa Theologica, here's Thomas Aquinas' definition of law. He says, first off, that it's a command of reason. It's for the common good. It's by somebody who has care of the community, and it must be promulgated. All right. All of those things have meaning. A definition, there's at least 6 or 7 different types of definitions. I'm not trying to be silly. But if you change the definition of something, you're going to change the way we understand the nature of something. So all those things that are there, we have to kind of break them apart. So let me just say, it's a command of reason. This is practical reason. This isn't speculative. This is what am I doing, all right? The common good, we already know that is something that will allow us all in this culture to flourish, okay? Someone who has care for the community. There has to be a legitimate authority. This cannot simply a law cannot be promulgated by just you or I for the community. It's somebody that has care of that community and has a legitimate authority. And it has to be promulgated. So, just like in civil law, we can't really argue ignorance. I'm sorry, I didn't know that was a speed limit around here. I mean, you could try, and maybe you can get away with it depending on particular ordinances, but we're supposed to know the law. So the law has to be made known. All right, so these 4 elements, a command of reason, it's practical reason, it has to be for the common good, not for individuals. I mean, it could be for individuals, but that individual cannot themselves be the ones benefiting from this when the rest of us don't. And then it has to be by somebody with legitimate authority, and it has to be promulgated. Those are 4 characteristics to law. And it's important because if any of those go away, we're going to have issue. We're really talking about a law now. So typically there are 4 types of law. The first type is eternal law. Okay, this is the law in God's own mind. So this is the logos. This is the word. We don't often think of those things in terms of a law because we always think of a law as something imposed from the outside. We don't look at a law as something that governs based on a design. Divine law, this is how law would appear to us as humans, given through revelation. So we're talking basically here the law of the Old Covenant and the law of the New Covenant. Divine law is you would not know had it not been revealed. Now, it doesn't mean this is mutually exclusive, because we'll see that natural law and divine law they overlap, specifically in the Ten Commandments, but nonetheless, divine law is revelation. Divine revelation. So natural law then is, and this is the definition, natural law is man's participation in eternal law. So again, what a different story we have. If we go back to understand our anthropology through Genesis, God made us in his image. Well, if God governs the universe, and he does that through the logos, the law of who is of himself, he actually shares that with us. And to the degree which he shares it with us, he does through natural law. So he writes this on our hearts. So our God is different than all these other gods. So the God of the Enuma Elish, where man was created as an afterthought, the effect of blood hitting the ground from the giants being torn apart by Marduk, and they then are slaves. What a different story you would have. And our God comes along and says, no, in our story, I'm making you in our image. And I will then share myself with you. And this is one of the ways. So human law, it should be drawn from natural law and reason. All right? And this could be positive law. Positive law is what comes, from what I understand, from legislation. And common law, I think, is usually through custom and such, from precedent. So these are the four types of law: eternal, divine, natural, and human. Human law often goes off on its own, unfortunately. Divine law is only what's been revealed, so if it hasn't been revealed, we don't know that. We couldn't make any claim to it. Natural law is something we could discover over time because we are slowly, little by little, appreciating and participating in God's own mind, the logos. Now, you'll see with our clip from Martin Luther King that there are two ways that a law can be unjust. Sometimes we have to follow an unjust law, and other times we absolutely will not follow an unjust law. Thomas Aquinas says, sometimes laws are written where they benefit the ruler rather than the common good. Has that ever happened in the United States? Yes. You can come up with all the scenarios you want. It's often made fun that people go and join local councils because that way they can get on either the zoning board or something and they get what they want. Okay. Well, that's an unjust law if they pass it because it benefits the ruler rather than the common good. But guess what? We should still follow it if greater harm would come otherwise. Okay, so if a legislation passes some sort of tax law that we know benefits them more than us, we can't just balk on it and say we're not participating. We might wreak more havoc and create greater injustices by not following it. So Thomas Aquinas says this is an unjust law. That's being said. But we should follow it because we might create more injustices by not doing so. Which is why we do this with most of the things in our laws, are favoring particular legislation, but we can't, even though our tax system, isn't that the joke, that it's a voluntary tax system, but nobody has the guts to give it a try, So, the other way a law is unjust is if it's contrary to eternal law, and in our case here, natural law. You do not follow that. So let's just say that abortion was a positive law, not that you were allowed to, but that you were forced to. No, I will not. Remember, the first principle we'll see of morality is I will not do evil that good may come of it. You cannot make me do that. If somebody says, well, what if they would kill us otherwise? Well, we've had plenty of people in our world that have done that. We just call them martyrs. At some point, we have to put our foot down. That is contrary to eternal law. I will not do it. It's an unjust law. Any questions on any of this stuff? After the next session, we can flesh all this out. Yes?
Well, if it benefits the ruler, then could it be contrary to divine and natural law?
Well, if it is. But if it's not contrary to that, like if it's just a provision that they've put in place that favors them, in other words, they tilt the ball their way, it may not be contrary, there's no intrinsic evil involved, and if by us not participating, we would wreak greater havoc. I'm not sure, I have to think of some better examples right now, but...
How about state lottery?
Okay, how would the state lottery, Frank, how would that work?
Gambling.
Well, gambling's not an intrinsic evil. Okay, maybe, well, I'm trying to think how you would apply this here. You mean maybe not accepting the funds because you think that it's being used improperly?
Some religious outfits, just gambling is not,
Yeah.
prohibited.
Well, I
So
guess,
then the state gets involved in gambling, so they're actually inflicting their will on that religion.
well, maybe that would be an issue of conscience for them. Yeah, I'm not quite sure that would fit into this. I have to think about it a little bit. But does anybody have any other suggestions, like laws that they favor a particular ruler, but yet I'm thinking like property taxes and such, not that that's unjust, but they may be collecting an unjust amount for unjust reasons, but what do? You can't not participate in that. There's too many other things that you would wreak havoc and cause greater harm by withdrawing yourself from that. What to think about that? So, we have to be thinkers. For somebody to say that as a Catholic, you need to stop blindly following the Pope. You need to think for yourself. We're all for that. This is all about using our reason, right? But a reason, as we'll see, doesn't have entire autonomy from everything else. So the role of reason is, one, we need to discover and apply the moral law. Let's reason it out. What is the moral law? And then we have to apply it. And by discovering it, it's through dialectic and reason. And then draw its own truth and authority from eternal law. How does this square with eternal law? So we're always comparing these things back and forth. John Paul II in Veritatis, Splendor talks about the autonomy of earthly realities. So he says, just the last sentence here, created things have their own laws and values which are to be gradually discovered, utilized, and ordered by men. So, we share in the dominion that God has in his creation. So a lot of these things we are discovering over time. And I could think environmental ethics would apply in a lot of this. And little by little, we're trying to say, how do we rightly and justly order the world and the use of the world, even though we understand that there's an autonomy to these things. And we're discovering their designs, all right? They're part of creation, but obviously separate than us. And when he talks about theonomy, he talks about this as opposed to autonomy, all right? So we can name the laws and values and discover what God has put there. And you could think of Adam in the creation mythos when he's naming all the animals and such. So he's by naming something, you're having power over them, and you're also placing them in an order. All right. So we have a certain participation in with him where we can, through discovery, both name these and give values to these things that we discover. Thomas Aquinas says God doesn't care from man from without. So these laws are never something from the outside that are imposed on us through the laws of physical nature. But he does this through reason, by its natural knowledge of God's eternal law. Again, that's the law in God's own mind, which is consequently able to show man the right direction to take in his free actions. So we're always going to have to try to play off this, how are we free by following a law that isn't, as long as we are clear, it's not imposed from the outside, but it governs us from the inside. We're going to have to constantly come back, and the easiest analogy is using oil in a car. You are not more free by choosing to use molasses, or just saying, to heck with them. Why is GM placing this law on me from the outside? It's the design of the car that the people who have designed it, the creators, we can say, that are telling us. This is how you want, if you want this car to act freely, be able to do what it's designed to do, then you have to follow the design of the car. We're just applying that to us. Our actions are only going to be free the closer they line up with our particular design. Now, the way that you can do this and easily illustrate this is with a healthy diet. Nobody seems to have an argument with that. You know, if somebody, my daughter said she ate nothing but Girl Scout cookies. Her daughter sold, I don't know, it filled up a corner of a room. And I think they had a Girl Scout cookie diet for like 2 days, 3 days. And my daughter explained that she lost 3 pounds. How is that possible? And I'd explained to her, it's calories. You know, I mean, it doesn't matter where the calories come from if you didn't, you know, this and that. But we know that if you kept up with that, like, isn't there one guy that went around and ate nothing but McDonald's or something like that? All right. Now, if he was trying to make the argument that he should be free to eat what he wants, the heck with all these rules of biology and nutrition, we would think, are you an idiot? You look at the design of your body in terms of health. Don't you want to live in accord with that design? Yes. Now, do you think you are more free or less free by understanding the design of your body and living, you know, in accord with it? Well, I'm more free, yes, because then you could do that which you were designed to do. So what you're calling autonomy is not the autonomy that we understand as freedom. It's an autonomy against freedom. So, you know, so that's always a good way to get it. But as you'll see, like when we do this dialectic exercise, you already know, I don't need to tell anybody that people don't have the patience for a discussion and an argument. We live in a bumper sticker world. And if you can't get your point out in about, you know, 20 syllables tops, or whatever the Twitter is, I don't have Twitter or tweet, then it doesn't make any sense to anybody and they don't want to have discussions. And synderesis, or sometimes you'll see it with a T and not a D, this is like the initial apprehension of all of this. A readiness, a preparedness, where these moral truths are grasped by our intellect. And the natural habitat, this is habitus, is impressed on our faculty. So, you know, this is in a sense, this is just a moral theological term that is telling us that, you know, we have a preparedness to receive all this. You know, again, we're built for this. So we will talk about the precepts of natural law, how we discover truths about the world, and always in terms of design. And we take these in through our senses. Now, how is natural law imprinted on us? Like, how does it exist within us? Well, there are 2 ways. You know, one is rational knowledge, and the other one is natural inclinations. So we have to think for ourselves. So you've probably been in discussions where you're begging the other person, I want you to think for yourself. I don't want you to accept anything that the church says blindly, as much as I don't want you to accept what the culture says blindly. So can we please, let's think through this and not just, you know, go along with one or the other, all right? So that would be our way of taking rational knowledge. And the way that we will do this with natural law is we'll do it through understanding our natural inclinations. And we will see that natural inclinations are going to be the first precept. There's a primary, a secondary, and remote precepts. The primary precepts are basically the natural inclinations. These are known to everybody. These are the things you cannot not know. Double negative. You cannot not know these. Nobody's going to be with excuse on these things. You don't have to tell anybody these things. So what's nice about this, in the way we're not trying to just intellectualize our faith, but because moral theology in the Catholic realm is based on this, we have a real bridge to start with somebody. So in terms of abortion or IVF or human sexuality, it could be gender theory. We don't have to say, well, you know, according to, you know, a particular verse in the Bible, it says this. That's all well and good, but if the person doesn't accept your scriptures, where do you go? I mean, I don't know about you, but I've had people show me where it says in the Pearl of Great Price. Is that right? Yeah, the Pearl of Great Price. That's not my scripture. I mean, no offense, but it doesn't mean anything to me. The same thing with the Quran. No disrespect, but it's not divine revelation to me. So, we don't have to convert somebody to being a Bible-believing Christian before we can impress these things on them. We can meet them right where they are and draw them through it. And with synderesis, they already have a preparedness for this. So we are going to do this through rational knowledge and by demonstrating the natural inclinations, which they cannot not know. Okay? But see, all this is presupposing a design. If you don't believe the human person has a design, then this sort of goes out the window. This is the principle of beneficence. It is the first principle of moral theology. It's the one you should never forget. Do good and avoid evil. This goes for everybody. And this goes for, I don't care if you're the Pope, a bishop, a deacon, a priest, a lay person. Just do this. Just do good and avoid evil. It's really not that difficult. But, we have a lot of forces that are bearing down on us. Now, we can argue over what may or may not be good. But people always do what's good for them, right? So we'll have to go back and think about some things are apparent goods and some things are genuine and authentic goods. But everybody will act in their own good. They'll work towards some good. And that, you don't have to explain it to anybody. People will always seek truth. We can talk about Augustine and how our hearts are restless, but our entire world, it's interesting, like even if Star Trek, right, which you have kind of like this, godless, almost like genderless society, but what is their mission? To go out and boldly seek, truths. I mean, this is almost a reflection of the human person. We always want to know things. Nobody wants to be lied to, or deceived. So even if somebody says, well, I don't really know if that's something I want to do, seek the truth. Okay, just in your statement, you're telling me you want to seek truth. Because you're not comfortable with the statement that I just made, and you're wondering whether or not it's true, so you're seeking whether or not that itself is true. I mean, there's no way around this.
Do you think people are fearful? People fear the truth and don't seek the truth?
Well, they could, which is why I think sometimes, again, we're going to have those individuals. C.S. Lewis said that people will be fooled. If they're looking for gold, it's easier to be fooled by brass than it is clay. So, there are these things that, again, Harmatia missed the mark, that Satan has cleverly designed that make us think we're pursuing something that's good, and we're not. Think of, love. I mean, some people, if they equate love with some romantic or sexual notion, they think they are fulfilling their truth. And in your case, what you said, yes, to understand that love is something greater than that, it's going to be a paradigm shift and an existential crisis for these people if they accept it. So, but we all do that to some degree, do we not? We get comfortable in who we are, and we don't want our nest shaken because it's going to change everything else that we do. I don't know. Does that analogy even make any sense? I don't know. Preserve one's life. Nobody has to tell you this. If you try to dunk a kid in the pool, they don't just sit at the bottom. They try to get back up, all right? We all have an inclination to preserve our life. It's why little kids cry, right? There's some discomfort that's there. It's why we learn to keep ourselves safe. Nobody has to tell you, don't do this to yourself, all right? Now, there's ways that we could expand on all this, but procreation. I mean, puberty and its effects and our drives towards each other are parts of natural inclination. So nobody has to tell people, hey, you're getting to a certain age, maybe you should think about, having children. Now, we've separated procreation from, the sexual act. So we're in a little different scenario today. But the urge is still there, right? I mean, even sociologists tell us that you see people cohabitating at the age when you saw people, for no lack of a better term, hooking up. The inclination is still there. And we as a species have never, we have the longest post-birth care span, if you want to call it that. There's a better way to say it than any other mammal that I'm aware of. We do not let our kids off on their own by 2 months old. We nurture them for years. Nobody really needs to tell us to do that. Now, maybe an evolutionary biologist would say that we figured that out over time. You know, we can get into an argument, well, how did God work? Did God work through evolution? Why not? You know, it's called Sharp Shopper. It's one of these discount grocery stores near my house. That's not near my house, but it's close enough that we go once every couple of months. And they have all these Bible pamphlets in there. And, you know, and they're the Mennonite, evangelical, fundamentalists, of course, are 6,000-year-old creationists. You know, so somebody was asking me about that and said, well, what does the Catholic Church say about that? I'm like, no. I mean, this isn't a museum that God put us in the middle of. I mean, where did oil come from? It came from plants that had decayed over, what, millions of years. Okay, so if oil is something that was necessary for the human person eventually to use for heating, well, then maybe this is all part of God's design. Did God simply just create a world that looked old? I mean, what are these fossils? Did he just make them look old? How about light? If we're seeing light in the sky that might come from, I don't know, 3 million light years away, well, okay, then the world has to be that old, or did God just create light in transit to give it that impression? You know, so, you know, we would say that those things aren't something that's found in science. They're not antithesis to our faith. We accept all that. So if somebody were to say to us, well, maybe the human person biologically through evolution grew to learn to take care of their children, we'd say, well, okay, but that's natural for the design of the human person. Okay? It doesn't put our thinking out of the realm. The last one is to live in society. We live in community, whatever that community is that we have designed. We don't have people living on islands. Right? I mean, I had one student tell me, he was a younger student, said they saw on National Geographic there was a program called Taboo, and it was some guy who lived on an island, and he tattooed himself like a leopard or something like that, and he wanted to live where nobody knew who he was, and he could be peaceful. And they went on and tell me all this, and I said, where did you see this? He said, National Geographic. I said, he obviously didn't have a problem with that one. You know, I'm not on National Geographic, and I don't even have that sort of inclination to be off on, if you want to be off on a deserted island, I think you wouldn't be on TV. I'm just throwing that out there. Okay, so these are the primary precepts of natural law. These are what we would call our 5 natural inclinations. So what we will do then in the secondary precepts, these now build off of the primary precepts. So all we do is we take a little bit of rational knowledge, we apply them to the primary precepts, and before you know it, we could start seeing how laws are being discovered, right? Because I want you to understand that with natural law, we discover some of these things. That doesn't mean that we've made them up. We've discovered them in the design. So they're a little more difficult to know. So with do good and avoid evil, I don't think we really have anything to add to that. With seeking truth, all right? Let's see. We might look at things wasting resources in environmental ethics. We might start to say, look, you know, any apathy towards the truth and any sort of behavior that's going to stem from that apathy, we can make an application of saying, well, if I'm not seeking truth, if I'm looking for the brass ring and not the gold ring, then any of those things that fall short, right, I can now declare that these things are not good for the human person. So it may not be right to say, well, we don't want to be wasters of the creation that we've been given. That may not be a primary precept. But we know that we are to seek truths, and once we realize we are custodians of this world, and that our apathy of these things can actually be something that, you know, is a derivative of that, then all of a sudden we start making a case for that. They're a little harder to know, and it may not be as clear, but that doesn't mean that they're not knowable. This one will be easier for you to understand how rational knowledge is applied. If I know that I should not hurt myself, and Frank knows he should not hurt himself, right? We both know that. All I have to do is take a little bit of rational knowledge and realize that Frank's another me, and I'm another one of him. So if I can't hurt myself, I can't hurt him. And I can't hurt others. So we can make a case for, even though thou shalt not kill, we understand that. we also understand that these people are extensions of us. And if I have an inclination to preserve my life, so do all the people that share my humanity, right? So we can make just a little bit of an extension, taking rational knowledge and applying it to that. Procreation and education of children. We can make a case against homosexuality, contraception, and procreation with contraception, let's just say homosexuality and such. We can make an understanding that it's not just the biology of the male and female that are complementary, but because we do know that that's true, right? I mean, I don't like the simplified argument, that the male genitalia, the female genitalia is complementary, therefore isn't it obvious that only these two should procreate? Yeah, that would be something we can pull from that. But we can make the case a little deeper by showing how homosexuality goes against this natural inclination. Particularly, it's something that I talk with people who have that inclination, the homosexual inclination. See, I got to watch them being equivocating here. They mimic reproductive acts, which I always thought was a little odd. Why do two men and two women mimic a reproductive act? Well, because there's something in there that this does seem like the natural way. So we can make a case then either for contraception. A natural law case against contraception would be that you are frustrating the natural ends of an act. And a male ejaculation only has one end. I mean, there's no other purpose for it. Now, somebody might say, well, does that mean that it always has to end in a pregnancy or such? Well, we can have that discussion, but once we know the design of the human person, even from a biological point of view, we can say that that has a particular end. And so does all the other experiences that we have between people. The fact that, I see somebody I'm attracted to, I understand that that stems from this. But I also know it may not be good for me, right? So I'm not going to go after the brass ring and miss the gold ring here. So we're just going to try to extend a little bit of rational knowledge to these things and put them into primary precepts. To live in society, let's just say that we find ways to help ourselves flourish, right? It's not as clean as you'd think. If you read through Aquinas and you read through, I can't think of the guy's last name. I know I sent you the book. It's a long, Budowisky. Charles Rice, that was another one I think I sent you. He wrote a book. He was either a law professor, I think he was a law professor in Notre Dame for a long time. Was it 50 Things to Know About Natural Law? And he goes through, and he really expands on a lot of this stuff in a very clear fashion, I should say. All right? But my point to all this isn't to try to make a convincing argument even here and now, just to say that we have ways to talk about contraception and homosexuality and the death penalty and other things that don't have to be strictly based in some sort of proof text from the Bible. We can construct some sort of natural law argument from that, and we'll start with something that we all cannot not know, and we'll work from that. I mean, even immigration, you'll start with probably seeking truth and preserving life and society. You'll work off of these natural inclinations, and you'll find ways to make secondary applications, and then eventually you can make a natural law argument. So you don't have to get somebody to convince them to accept, the encyclical, Popularem Progresso or something. You can work through them on this. Remote precepts, these still remain reasonable, but they're very difficult to know, and they're not known by everybody. There's a lot of circumstances that have to be taken into consideration, and there's a lot of speculation that comes on in this realm. So last week we learned about the principle of double effect, how there could be bad things that occur when you're trying to do something good, but as long as the bad doesn't flow from the good, as long as what you're doing is not an intrinsic evil, as long as the intention is right and the proportions are right, then therefore, yes, remove the leg that's gangrene. Or yes, remove the uterine, the cancerous uterus, even though there's a child inside. We can make these arguments. Just war theory will fall into this too. Now we didn't go over that in this class, but there are what they call ad bellum, the to war, certain things have to be in place, and then there's in bella, even once you're in war, all things aren't good, right? So there's always proportionate means that you have to use. So anyway, there's all this criteria that's been developed, but it came out of a natural law tradition. You're not going to find the local New Covenant Christian Center, minister who has strong ways to argue out in the public square, against particular types of warfare, or let's say, even, principles of double effect. They're going to have to search for, even though they'll call it biblical ethics, they're going to search for proof text that they think can apply to something like that. But we know in the realm of science, in the realm of, maybe even the way we have technology in war, good luck trying to, find proof texts that are going to work for you there. We can build this off of natural law. So as I said then, this is a bridge to the world. We will ask in a theological sense that whatever we are talking about, if we, looking at our own design, determine this is good for the human person, then it's something we ought to be done. Our acts are directed towards specific ends. We can know them, all right? And all types of things. This is why we have heating subsidy. My mind's gone. Heating subsidies for people that are poor. We understand that it's good for them, right? There's certain things that are necessary for their health. Okay, well, where are we going to find in Scripture? Well, we should find take care of the poor, but how do we work out who gets this and how they get it? I mean, all these things they're going to start with a natural inclination that a person has to preserve their own life. It's going to move to a secondary precept that they are an extension of us, and then we have some obligation then to aid them in the preservation of their health. We can make certain arguments with health care. This doesn't mean that you adopt one particular health care system, but it's why the Catholic Church says that health care is a right. It doesn't mean that you have full-blown access to everything, but basic health care is not something that is added on. It's based on the dignity of the human person understood through their natural inclinations. So you can make social justice arguments. That word social justice, I don't know when in the media about 10 years ago I heard, he's the one guy, he was a, Glenn Beck, I know he's Mormon, but he came off about social justice, that if your parishes are talking about social justice, I can't remember how he said it. He said, get out of it and go to another parish. I said, well, I'd have to leave my church. But I don't know what he was calling social justice. But the way that we understand social justice is all based on these laws and the inclinations the human person has. And that somehow we have to find out how to live in society. So a different understanding. But it's all based on our design. These two scriptures you should just put into your minds. Romans 1:20, Romans 2:12. This is so, natural law is something that's scripturally based. And therefore, again, as a bridge to the world, it leaves us all without excuse. So 1:20, ever since the creation of the world, this invisible nature, the eternal power and deity of God, that's, eternal law. It's been perceived in the things that have been made. So we discover this in creation, and we discover it also in ourselves. So you're without excuse. You can't kill people indiscriminately and then say, well, I really didn't know that this was wrong, or I thought I had a good reason to do it, that type of thing. Romans 2:12, all who have sinned without the law, like if you've never had the law, then you're going to perish without the law. If you have sinned under the law, you'll be judged by the law. So the law shows us what is written, it's written in our hearts, and our conscience bears witness to this. And our conflicting thoughts, the way that we use euphemisms today, right? They either accuse or perhaps excuse us. Now, I don't know what other denominations that don't accept natural law, what they make from this. I've never really heard good arguments. I'll talk a little bit why this is not a Catholic thing, but in some ways it is. Let me make sure. Now it's coming up. All right, so historical examples of natural law applied. Do we all know the Antigone story with Saul? I have the video, so you will see the video. And I'm sorry for these names. but Creon was the king, and he had two sons, and they fought on different sides, one against him. So the son who fought against him, he declared that he should not be buried, which in their understanding was, this man will never be with his gods, there's no dignity in that. He has two sisters. One of his sisters is Antigone.
Excuse me, wait a minute,
Oh.
sorry. I'm sorry, who is he in that sentence? Who has these two sisters, the father or?
The man who had died.
The son?
Yeah, my mind just went blank.
That's all right.
I want to say
I just didn't know which he was.
Skip the name.
Paramenius.
Okay. I'm following him so fast. Yes,
So
got it. Okay.
You'll see in the video that the one sister declares that Creon cannot make a law that goes against the laws that we know are wrong. So I will disobey it, and she disobeys it even at being killed. So I'm going to have to pause this. I couldn't embed these. For whatever reason, either it doesn't work in this, or I get some sort of signal that says it's a copyright infringement. I'm embedding it from YouTube.
I
But
was able to go through there.
did you? Well, I can go through there, but I wasn't able to embed it into this particular PowerPoint. Another example that's famous is George Mason, how he argued before the court of Virginia against the slavery statute. The laws of nature are the laws of God. Now, he's talking about nature in the way that we're using it. And there's no power on earth that could supersede these. So, heroic men. The Nuremberg trials, the tragedy of all this is that Hitler broke no laws. That's just the tragedy of it. So they developed crimes against humanities. You can't make a law against a crime against humanity unless you can make the argument that nobody has to tell you that this is evil. And so it was a natural application that they made to condemn the war criminals and to develop that type of understanding. Martin Luther King Jr., I have this video, and I'm sorry there's no subtitles for it, but this is his letter from a Birmingham prison. Now, he obviously was not Catholic, so on the next slide I'll talk to you why this is not a Catholic thing, but sort of is. So why did Martin Luther King Jr. so eloquently write this? Because he had philosophy at Boston College. So he got access to Aquinas. Another philosophy, you'll see him quote Martin Buber, the I, thou, and it. And interestingly enough, too, he wrote this from a prison, so he didn't have Google. So we'll learn that, next week with virtues, and that memory is not a virtue, but it is a quasi-virtue. In other words, memory has to be present for other things to take flourish. So here's a man that sat down with nothing but the quiet of his mind and the skill of his wit and his education, and he penned probably was one of the most beautiful things that you can read, according to natural law. So I'll bring that up now. So those are probably the four more famous applications of natural law. Now, is this a Catholic thing? It is, but it doesn't have to be. I'm not saying that the Orthodox wouldn't accept it, or my Lutheran minister friend last night, he would accept natural law. And there are some Lutheran, a famous Lutheran theologian, Karl Broughton, he accepts it. But typically you will not find this in Protestant circles because of their understanding of the human person after the fall. In other words, our intellect is so darkened, how are you going to apply rational knowledge? How can you possibly ferret this out? You can't trust human knowledge. So we're only going to rely on divine knowledge. Even if they don't quite always understand that you're still interpreting something. The Bible is not a self-interpretive document, but nonetheless. So what else is nice about this is it refutes cultural relativism. So for someone to say, well, in that culture it's fine, in our culture it isn't, so we shouldn't impose our ways on those. Well, okay, if you're talking about us planning a McDonald's or something in that particular community, fine. But we can fall back and say, as long as we're talking about human beings, we could find out their natural inclinations based on the design of the human person, and we could build a morality off of that. So much of what the Catholic Church understands as morality, even though, remember in the beginning, we were talking about how we have to have more biblical basis for what we're doing, support, it's still based in natural law. So it gives us a nice bridge, so we can do a great job of getting into bioethics, environmental ethics, and other types of ethics like that, and still maintain our moral standards without trying to simply base everything on here's what Scripture says, which they would not accept. Okay. Any questions? All right. That's it. Let's take a break.